So first of all, thank you very much for tuning in to this webinar series, the Rankscale AI Summer Camp. Today, we are pleased to be capable of stating that we are hosting a webinar together with Rasheed Badawi. Rasheed Badawi, we can state, is one of the friends of Rankscale and is also leading AI search at Salesforce. Besides that, because he just somehow has more than 24 hours in a day, is also doing a PhD in AI search. And today, Rasheed is going to guide you through how you can actually use the data from AI search engines, from, for example, AI search platforms like Rankscale, to have it as an input for your product, have it as an input for your positioning. Just before we kick off, I'm always curious where everybody is joining from, so please put it in the chat. Then we know where everybody's coming from. We're personally from Vienna in Austria, but curious to see where everybody else is from. And if you have a question during the presentation, just put it in the chat. And then after the presentation, after the webinar, which will end around like 40 minutes, then we can dive into these questions, and then we have some Q&A session. All right. So once again, Rasheed, thank you very much for taking the time to also get all of this data, all of these slides together. And then I'm very, very happy to give the stage to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jules. I'm very excited to kind of share this perspective. We'll leave some room for questions at the end as well, just so we can tackle some live. But this is really just to kind of get everyone really in the field of digital marketing. We're not just talking about search or SEO. This is where we can utilize, AI search data. It's almost like a treasure trove of how much information and insights that many people are just kind of really not grasping and not extracting to provide meaningful insights from a product, brand, as well as the rest of the digital marketing teams. So just to kind of give you an overview, these are kind of how we'll go through the agenda. I tend to add more wording and context as much as I can, but we'll leave it all as takeaways in the slides. So I'll kind of make sure I kind of cover the key points. But really, within Act 1, or the first kind of part of the presentation, we'll take really some real AI answers, just kind of generated in terms of multiple different industries, and then show you when we're looking at an AI search answer, at least from an SEO. I love SEO, and I'll always feel like I'll have a tendency towards SEO and search. There is this avenue where, a search lens, an AI search or an SEO lens will look at, this is our presence, and this is what we need to do to increase our presence. But the amount of kind of hidden data that exists within them is massive. So we'll go through 5 examples of industry prompt answers. The instrument, how do we actually go about and do this at scale? Because, one thing is to kind of run things on prompts on ChatGPT, even in an anonymous experience, but it's another thing to make sure that you have this kind of a framework that you can constantly refer to. The overlooked signals, we'll touch on that. So after we do the instrument, what are the actual signals? What are the actual extrapolated data in terms of the themes? The influence loop, this is where we really kind of gather multiple marketing teams. You'll be surprised how many kind of channels really kind of weigh into the outputs. And then the internal narrative, especially kind of working in different organizations, like how do you kind of communicate some of this so that you get people internally on board? So from the 5 examples, really, and again, I use multiple different industries and just kind of conceptual question and answers under each, mainly all non-brand in nature, but something in the e-bikes industry where, somebody's asking for a best commuter e-bike under a certain dollar value. You see in the answer, it's talking about brand A and brand B. However, the brand that, the person who's actually looking and setting this up is being talked about in a way where it's almost a tertiary mention, as well as the other aspect where it kind of gives into the fact that the range that it has provided, it's almost like a negative sentiment, is actually already provided to them without even asking. So there is all of these aspects where the framing, whenever somebody's asking about multiple brands, especially when doing comparison prompts, which we'll go to shortly, is the framing signal. Like, how are you always framed? Sometimes even if somebody's not asking specifically about the product features, it will provide that because it's seeing that abundance in the AI search answers. So really, it's one of those aspects where we're talking about the framing signal in itself. If we move more towards skincare, something in the beauty industry, where we're talking about accuracy, and I'm seeing this a lot, whether it's at Salesforce or other customer brands we work with, the the actual facts that are outdated or something that's really non-existent today that still linger in the search results. So there's an instance where brands sunscreen, is that reef safe? How much does it cost? And in the answer, it's actually at least referencing some of the old material. You'll be surprised how much gunk you would have out there or some of the outdated articles. But it did mention that this is one of those aspects where you have oxybenzone, which is not ideal, and the price tag of it is actually incorrect at the same time. So you actually have two avenues where you have misrepresentation for your product and or brand. Then the switching signal, internet service provider, especially when you're talking about, specifying like, is this brand in terms of internet worth it? Whether there's a kind of an avenue or an inclination in the answer where it's actually suggesting a switch, where giving you and introducing another competitor in that avenue. So you'll also see that and we actually have the ISP example in one of the Rankscale kind of like dashboards, but you'll see that where even if you're not asking about switching, it'll kind of provide that alternative for you and maybe even nudge in that aspect where it's talking and pulling that real person experience from the different cited sources. Then the absence signal. So this is something in the hospitality industry, the travel industry, where you're actually trying to kind of get a sense of the different types of places where you can stay, whether it's at a branded chain or an actual hotel. And this is the avenue where you'll be asking these questions and a variety of these questions, but the brand is nowhere near present in the answer. So this is really an avenue where we're not even there yet to understand how people are talking about us. Do we have the right information, accuracy, and so forth? And then the strength signal. This is in the running shoe industry. We're seeing this also quite a bit, where the answer itself is placing you in a strength format where it's telling you as the searcher that these runners are kind of commended by physiotherapists. People in the nursing industry are utilizing them. So it actually kind of reinforces a lot of features that even other teams are not able to kind of put two and two together to leverage on their behalf. So there's this avenue where it's like a strength signal. So you can really see the variance in just kind of looking at one prompt per industry, how much kind of these little intricacies, especially when you look at them at scale, because we're tracking multiple hundreds, maybe thousands of prompts to really get that core essence of how that's related. Of the 5 industries and the 5 answers, none of them are really an SEO ranking problem, even though SEO is a really big foundation in terms of kind of looking at information, but it's really is not that aspect. We've seen things that are ranking in SEO, but not showing up in AI search. So even in the terms of that absence avenue, it's really not necessarily an SEO or a classic SEO. And just to kind of give that little bit of an overview, a blast from the past, even though it was until a year ago, from 1995 to 2024, really from an SEO lens, we always looked at if my website ranked. And then you earn that click, you make sure that that presence is there, and then you depend on the rest of the website to do the convincing, making sure you have the right CTA, CRO, and so forth. However, now, we're asking ourselves as SEOs, just from that lens again, are we present there? Am I being cited as a source of information? Am I being framed well? Am I being accurately represented in the AI search answers? And these kind of go a long way in terms of especially when you think about the adoption rates that's happening right now in terms of conveying that internally and doing something about it. So a couple of numbers, really, 14% of marketers track AI search as a separate channel. We know this usually probably starts with the SEO team in some sort of fashion. You'll also notice in your GA analytics or Adobe and so forth, any of the analytics that you're looking at, you're seeing always this big increase in direct as well as referral. And what direct really is a lot of the times is doing is grouping things together when it's really not clear to it. And then referral traffic, of course, you want to really make sure you kind of dial down into LLM referral traffic, not just any referral traffic coming into you. But then it's a really low percentage of how people are actually looking at that. And then 70% of the AI traffic. So even if we look at the LLM traffic coming in, and this is when they click and they kind of come to the website or the experience itself, it's dark by default. We don't know what's going on in the search answers. We don't know if it was a convincing one. We don't know if it was scrutinizing. We don't even know if it was accurate. And then these platforms really kind of inhibit that sort of information, just kind of the way that they're interacting. We even have been working with the paid teams where we're realizing that even the sponsored data, when you run ads, that's still being kind of inhibited in terms of getting true usage data. And then this one is actually really surprising to me. 16% of brands track how they perform in AI search. This is a percentage of the brands that really are looking at themselves and saying, how am I being portrayed? I've had actual specific examples just to kind of like, purchase something, and I was really excited. Everything on the website seemed great until I went into an AI search experience, and it completely shifted my decision. So you can kind of get a sense of how many percentage, it's a very low percentage of brands that are actually doing this, small and large. Now to get into the instrument itself. So like I said, these were specific one-off examples where you can run each prompt. We do this all the time. We hear it from different marketers all the time, especially if you're in this space. People are searching one prompt at a time. And of course, even though that has some merit to it, but you really need to have an instrument where you can run these at scale. And the most important part, I would say, there's so many like ways to kind of track prompts in tools. So, obviously there's multiple tools out there. Personally, I think Rankscale is in the top 3. I love Rankscale. It's one of those avenues where you can utilize, but really just to kind of take a neutral stance, like this is an LLM search monitoring tool. You need to have one, whether it tracks for ChatGPT, multiple LLMs, and so forth. And the reason is, especially for somebody who doesn't have this context, you're looking at the AI visibility, you're talking about the sentiment themes, the citations, and your share, as well as the competitor share. So this is why it's really important to adopt an LLM search monitoring tool where you can run these prompts at scale so that you can start extracting these insights, again, at scale. Otherwise, you can kind of choose your own pickings with prompts and try to kind of convey something that would really feel off and not well sampled, which is really important. I think some of the most important ways is how you ask an LLM. We have to kind of take 2 perspectives at it. The perspective of the person who's going to be exploring your solution or product or brand. And then there's a perspective where you're actually trying to kind of extract information. And this is from the marketing side. You do it on the business where you're looking for very specific prompts so that you can actually kind of prompt it, no pun intended, to really give you something of that nature that you're trying to see if you are being compared, if you are trying to be trusted, and so forth. So what I would usually suggest is within these 5 themes, put together a list of 100 prompts per theme. The very first one is, am I found? This is where you kind of ask very relevant questions without using your brand or any other brand's name in the prompt list. And then you want to first know if you're present. So we seen one of the examples earlier, that brand wasn't even talked about to even begin understanding what other insights are there. And now, even if you are not found, the rest of the other brands, the themes will help you try to understand where you are. So number one, am I found? You'll get a sense of where that brand is. Then the second one is positioning. How am I framed? So you're actually asking, and I've seen this with small, medium-sized businesses that don't have a lot of mentions in terms of am I found? But when people are still asking very direct questions about that brand. The third one is really comparison. So sometimes when you're asking for something in silo, especially if you kind of have worded it in a certain way, it'll give you a certain type of answer. But when you're doing all of these comparison type prompts, especially with a very closely related business, you're really understanding what features that it's highlighting that you have that and the other businesses have. And this goes to both pros and cons. LLMs try to be neutral, but they're not always in that case, especially when you can do so much to influence what features are there or what's being misrepresented. And then for reputation, this is a series of questions. And Jules, I can send some example kind of lists for each if anybody's really interested where they can swap out some of those. But you're asking very specific questions where like, is this brand safe? Is this brand something, did they have any sort of issues with data? Is this brand something I can rely on? Payment methods, etc. All of these aspects are things that people are going to be checking. And then this is where we want to really entice to kind of get a sense of if you're asked directly from an LLM perspective, how does it really convey you without trying to kind of dig through and read between the lines? And then lastly, this is something, like I said, we're seeing more and more often. When you have all of your product features, your kind of specifications, the kind of these competitive advantages, everything that you're placing in terms of price, in terms of facts, data about your products, this is a list of prompts so that you can organize it and then you can cross-reference the answers if it is actually giving you the right results in terms of really very straightforward information. Now, each of these themes kind of really fall in to give you some sort of insight. So this is where we'll start connecting it all together slowly. From a discovery standpoint, like we said, are you there? Are you present? What issues or problems are entirely absent from in terms of a brand? The positioning, like I just mentioned, like what type of adjectives and themes do people talk about you? Sometimes you will see the same ones over and over again. You can ask the same question in 20 different ways, 50 different ways, 100 different ways, but you'll also start begin picking up on the themes because it's already kind of learned in its core. Then the comparison, like we just mentioned, those avenues and attributes that competitors will have, are you suggested as a better example of a competitor to even begin with besides adjectives? Reputation and then fact check, which I just mentioned there, and we should have some examples. Okay, so the signals that brands overlook from AI search. And again, I ran this with like Rankscale. There's these avenues where I kind of feel like I just scratched the surface in terms of all of these different ways that you can organize this data. But in terms of the internet service provider, we ran a series of prompts. So you see the very first number on the far left, 44.2% visibility. This is kind of these avenues where we put a series of prompts that are in that discovery bucket where is it even present there or not? And then we kind of immediately get a sense, okay, 44.2% is actually not bad in terms of you being present when people are not even talking about you. They're just looking for a solution. But the concerning aspect is that brand, you guys, at least in the US side, can probably guess which brands are which by the certain themes without naming names. But you can see that sentiment completely, in terms of that brand that we ran it for, has a 40% with 45 specific negative mentions. So like really where I'm hovering over here, as well as anytime there are other brands that were mentioned, you can see like a big difference in terms of how they're being portrayed overall. What I think is even more interesting, so you can always kind of look at your sentiment. It will organize it by brands, how their sentiment is being seen. And then the really cool stuff comes in the sense of that themes, the series of themes that come by each LLM at least the ones that you're tracking for, so that we have a very sense of understanding of those themes put all together. So right through, really, you're kind of getting sense of like the slower speeds. Hidden fees is a very common one with a particular ISP. A lot of them kind of really talk about availability, in terms of the costs, in terms of the streaming kind of related avenues. So really, there's a ton to extract over here, and really just to kind of really understand that framing from that sense. What I think is also really interesting is there's two sets of data. If you look at your bot logs, you will see, at least from ChatGPT, there's like this training bot, there's a live bot that's fetching at the same time. I think it's really important to look at the training data, because it's almost like, I would say, a little bit harder to influence, because that's really part of that core set in terms of where the LLM is learning from. However, it's always kind of iterating on that. That's why we'd look at web grounding average sentiment as well, because that almost is like a leading indicator in that avenue. But the big takeaway really here is, people are seeking alternatives, especially when they're kind of running this ISP brand in terms of kind of these insights. Also, a lot of these positive things that they're not really capturing is like these no contract plans, those lower monthly costs that some of the other competitors are really highlighting here. This is the example of a running shoe company. And you can see a big stark difference in terms of that sentiment. We're talking about from 40% to 85.6% positive sentiment when it comes to talking about this particular brand in the running shoe industry. Some of the screenshots are really gathered, which I think is really important, especially as you try to now influence it, which I'll get to in just a moment, is really looking at that in a way that we are kind of monitoring that on a trended scale. I don't think you will have big shifts one week to the other unless there is any sort of kind of PR news or so forth, but it's also really interesting. It's really important to keep that constantly so that you can always kind of revert back to it and look at the specific outputs from there. But yeah, generally speaking, you can always look at the sentiments, the brand tables, and then this little diagram where you can actually toggle between the different ones will show you how much you change in terms of the strength as you keep doing your AI search efforts coordinated with digital marketing teams. This is something I thought is also really interesting. Similar to the themes, this is the same running shoe industry where we were looking at the sentiment of each of the brands that we just talked about, but this is where you can actually go and click on the competitor sentiment. So it's almost like you're seeing it from their viewpoint to really understand how they are seeing their strengths and weaknesses. So immediately as you start to do this tracking, you begin to understand, if you were that competitor, what are they kind of leveraging? What are their negative aspects that you can actually leverage on your behalf? But like I said, there's a lot here. I'm happy to kind of, tackle some questions, but just really wanted to capture a large piece of like this narrative fill. There'll be these validated pillars in terms of your brand, and then against the competitor brand. And then there is this narrative hill that has to be relayed to the product teams, as well as the brand teams, as well as the PR teams in terms of that perception, especially if there's these new iterations on the products. So yeah, this would be the competitor X-ray strategy where you get to kind of see that from that competitor lens. And real quick, these objection themes, so really they're kind of under three themes. We're talking about objection, positive, or mainly objection positive. We can even talk about accuracy. But when we're talking about something I would convey over to that team, I would kind of mention all of this language that surrounds this brand in terms of all of these type of themes that I would be relaying over to the product team, customer team, brand teams. I've seen this happening in action on a different industry in the appliance space, where they're really people were having a lot of complaints that are no longer applicable. That all it needed was this concerted effort within all of the different marketing teams to convey that new messaging. And at the same time, there was this company, kind of like the beauty industry. They were kind of trying to talk about how people are searching for, hair conditioning creams and gels and so forth. And even the language in terms of how people are searching, or that association cream, gel, like actually made a big difference, because immediately alerted them that this is not really understanding what our product is. It's actually really misunderstanding anything that we're doing on the page itself. So really in practice, you really want to highlight those objection themes, highlight them to the, and forward them over to the product as well as the brand, as well as the digital marketing teams. Like we've seen a lot of big influence with social, as many of you are probably aware how much of an influence, LinkedIn, Reddit, all of these avenues that are kind of a big placeholder for the conversations. And then at the same time, on a more positive note, you want to kind of emphasize those positive themes. You want to kind of make sure that these don't get lost in the mix, especially when you're kind of conveying that to the same product teams. You're not really trying to depends on kind of the outputs and the results. You're really trying to provide that balanced kind of perspective. The other one I would say, just to kind of, in the sense of time, the inaccuracy themes as well. So I would kind of layer in the objective, the positive, and then the accuracy themes, especially if you have a very low kind of, or a very high inaccuracy that kind of is associated with your brand as well as products. Something I would do just to kind of add that data layer into it, just to kind of give us a sense of grounding. What we've noticed is, and I think there's several studies on this, when people are searching in ChatGPT and so forth, they're finding these themes and they're actually going to Google and they're actually typing brand, theme, things that they're seeing because it stood out to them. If somebody's talking about, these hidden fees, you can see an instance where you add the brand name, hidden fees, and then what you will do, just to kind of make sure that you have a sanity check, is try to understand from Google search or keyword planners, any of the SEO tools, to see if there is search volume behind these. And we've seen that correlation where what's being discussed, what are the certain themes that currently circulate around the brand, are what people actually put two and two together in a sense of a keyword as well as that theme. And this is just to, again, so that we're not really, just saying this is what's happening. We're kind of adding some of that quantitative data into it. I would also highly recommend Google Trends. Google Trends has done a lot of different improvements within it. I think there are certain API aspects that you actually can connect to nowadays, but this is a sense where you're seeing a category interest or a feature within your brand or product lines, and you can immediately start to see, because sometimes you can attribute it and say, like, there is decline in the industry for interest, right? Or what people are searching for. You can actually see if there is actual demand growth in terms of that trend, and see where your brand is in correlation to that thematic Google trend. Okay, so let's say we have all this data. We got these objectives, we got these influences. We're quantifying this with certain information. We're putting together lists of themes for the different product managers, brand teams. I mean, at least I've worked with them. Now, what happens after? This is where, like, we talk about the influence. And what's really been a big eye-opener, I think, for all of SEO going into AI search and trying to kind of influence that, is the number of digital marketing teams that are involved, that are vital to make these influences in terms of the AI search answers. So it's really not about, keep in mind, the average number, at least what I've been seeing, is 10% of your own website is being used as a source of citations in terms of like a really good source, but 90% of the time it's using these multiple different avenues across different websites and different kind of these syndication citation points. So I think the really big takeaway here is to kind of make sure you're really aligned with all of these teams. We've had very specific examples where something from a social media team, something from a PR team, each of those had their own very unique outputs, or influence in the AI search results. So talk about, converging a lot of these, coordinating, I would say even with half of these folks in one go in terms of brand messaging, goes such a long way with making sure that now that we understand what we're being perceived at, how do we make sure that we can start influencing it? And these are kind of some of the examples. Again, it kind of varies by industry where you're kind of working with those teams to do the fact check failures, the positive themes, the comparison losses. These are really important aspects where sometimes, you're trying to find the right team that can really address these, especially from the core up all the way to publishing on the page, and then having the PR newsroom team really have these articles that are really kind of important and more likely to be syndicated and influence even those third-party citations. We're working sometimes with like some of the partners team. You can have the email team also kind of make some of those messaging updates as well. So with that really said, it's really in terms of kind of putting it all together, all the big pieces, we're really talking about listening. We're doing all of these kind of extractable insights based off of the prompt framework, based off of the themes, based off of accuracies, and so on and so forth. Then we route these insights to multiple teams. What I would suggest is always, I'll have this in the following slides, is having this one big scorecard that tells you everything in one go. And then you'll have these multiple teams that will kind of start joining and really understanding what they can influence from that avenue. Then we're really talking about unifying that story. Makes such a big difference when you are saying the same thing in multiple channels. The amount of LLM impact, we've seen so many different channels really trying to convey a campaign, even just a very short one. It will be completely hidden by them unless you're really rallying up all those folks to do this at scale. When I say publish everywhere, I mean on the actual website, earned, and the cited sources. Again, people kind of shy away from the different citations that talk about them. But a lot of the times you're kind of asking them to correct certain inaccuracies, certain kind of misrepresentations, the latest information, and so on and so forth. Even when it comes to Reddit, being part of that conversation goes a long way in terms of impacting these updates. And then what would happen is AI would relearn. AI is still constantly kind of going through these cycles and trying to gather all of this resource. I mean, it's in its best interest to keep itself updated, and we have the tools or really kind of the avenues to utilize it in that format. And then lastly, what I would say is this is the internal narrative. This is where you're really trying to kind of convey these findings. So like I mentioned earlier, my suggestion in terms of how do you kind of really, all of the things we just went through, how do you really package it up all together in the way that you can start to circulate throughout your organization? We're talking about AI visibility share. We're talking about the sentiment themes, the citation share, how much of your kind of you being that source, the demand in terms of a quantitative aspect to really say, hey, you know what, this is actually, something that's actively being searched on in real time. And then the fact check accuracy. So, the suggestion I would have is just to kind of group these into these kind of 6 parts of the scorecard. That way you kind of can convey a very big picture and really have all the teams really dialed in so that you can also start tracking against it moving forward. Again, this depends by industry. How do you kind of influence the stakeholders? There's a lot of really good case studies out there. I mean, I've seen a really good one by Forrester and a B2B AI search demand. And, something where 94% of, people in the B2B space are kind of utilizing generative AI tools to help influence their decisions. So, and then from a CFO and exec team, you can actually see that today. And again, multiple reports where AI referral traffic is a lot more, likely to convert. People are very convinced at a certain stage. Again, you don't know what the conversation led up to being, leading to your website and converting. From the product leadership team, a lot of the times you'd be surprised how much they would brainstorm, but not actively listen to the conversations that are happening out there. I think they may not to kind of trigger any team, but like sometimes you'll hear something from a social listening exercise or something from here and there. However, really when you're kind of really collating all of this really recurring themes based off of, your presence, your comparison, what people talk about you, it goes a long way in terms of informing the product leadership team. For brand and CMO, I think this is one of the easier conversations to have, especially when you kind of highlight key sentiment trends. We've seen instances where a new sentiment pops up. based off of a series of, product launches, articles, any sort of evolution of some sort. And a lot of the times the team is just really interested to just maintain and get a pulse check on how they're being perceived moving forward. So you can kind of put together these sentiment trends, validating it by the pillars, and then the influence map, which you can kind of work with the rest of the marketing teams to say, this is where we are today, this is where we want to be tomorrow. And just to kind of really round this all up, let's say you want to do this on Monday, or you really want to start to get this kicked off. Because again, we went through a lot of different avenues, a lot of different metrics, but really it just starts by building out that prompt library. Use the 5 themes that we just went through. Like I said, Jules, I can send you some examples of ones that you can kind of swap out. Then have this in a LLM tracking tool. Like I said, I am a fan of Rankscale. I like working with the team there. There's a lot of evolution there. Then you can start to baseline those 6 numbers in terms of the scorecard I just mentioned. Then I would say, just to kind of not overbear it, route 2 insights this quarter. Like sometimes just one insight I've seen spark a very interesting conversation. You have multiple, especially if you have this 6 scorecard kind of layout. But really the idea is to just route 2 insights, and then whether it's something that's objection themed or a positive themed or something that's an inaccuracy, this is what really will get the conversation started. And then any sort of efforts, let's say you align, okay, we need to fix X, Y, and Z. We need to kind of validate, we need to fix inaccuracies. This is where you kind of start to build your own case study internally to say, this is what AI was talking about us 2 months ago, and this is what it's talking about us today. And like I said, it sometimes seems overwhelming, but it really, the biggest kind of influence is just tackling a bunch of those teams, whether it's the social media, product team, the PR team, as well as SEO, can really go a long way. We've seen it happen where like within a week or two, we've had some kind of corrections, if you will, but really that's the name of the game. And yeah, I hope that was helpful. Like I said, we'll leave this as a takeaway, and then we'll send like prompt suggested lists for each of the themes for everyone.
I think this was a great and very informative webinar. So thanks a lot, Rasheed, for sharing your insights. As promised, we right now have a quick Q&A session. Does anybody has a question that they had in mind during the presentation or that just pops up right now? All right, we got a question from Eva, if I pronounce the name correctly. How often do you run sentiment analysis? When is it time to check if what you attempted to fix was actually fixed? Love the sentiment analysis in Rankscale. Rasheed, so how often do you need to run a sentiment analysis, and what time do you actually check if you see what you tried to fix is fixed?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Most LLM tracking tools, I think Profound or like Rankscale or any of the popular ones, they would usually run prompts daily. So like the sentiment insights, you would actually have the data for them daily. In terms of actually preparing a report and putting together certain insights for it, that would be something that I would suggest doing monthly or even quarterly, because it depends on the organization, as well as we've had instances where we wanted to correct a very specific theme, like, you know what, the pricing is very off, or you know what, it's using an old product name. And it was a very concerted effort on that, and that could be as little as a month. But anywhere from a month to quarterly, like I said, any of the LLM tracking tools, I would suggest running the prompts once daily, just to kind of at least have that, because at a certain point, you'll realize week over week where the shifts started to happen. So that's where you really want to make the case for yourself there. But hope that answers the question.
Then I will directly ask a question as well. Like, what do you see is one of the biggest pitfalls that you actually see teams make when it comes to, for example, AI search? Right now we have seen sentiment is really important. Like, why do you think that so many teams actually just completely ignore it?
Actually, you hit on probably like a big pain point I'm seeing really in multiple different companies. Sometimes when there is a negative sentiment, brands usually tend to try to ignore it and hope it, moves away. And it actually doesn't. If actually you're kind of trying to remove all mentions about X, Y, and Z, it stays within the training data and it's never really updated. So if you're really trying to actually counter it, Jules, I would actually go and readdress that specific pain point. You can actually be very upfront with it and use language that's showcased that now that we did X, Y, and Z, this is kind of the new feature. This is what the product was formerly known as, rather than just assuming the new product name. Or like anything where like we're talking about hidden fees. You know what? We've heard that, hidden fees is a common thing. You address this, you properly address this so that the LLMs are reading it. Hopefully you actually properly address this so that otherwise, you're really trying to, from a product or a service standpoint. But yeah, what I've seen is people just try to ignore it and hope it moves away. And ironically, it sticks even more if you don't tackle it head to head. Kind of like humans, if you don't talk about something and you try to ignore it, it'll just probably build up rather than just, hey, like this is what's going on. This is what was mentioned about us. This is the older price. This is the new one, and be very upfront and straightforward for it, for the LLMs at least.
Perfect. Makes a lot of sense. Anybody else that has a question? If you don't, please also go to the LinkedIn of Rasheed. If I'm correct, it's just Rasheed Badawi, also on LinkedIn. Follow him. He's also publishing some interesting insights. So definitely, if you want to stay up to date, also with the PhD that he is right now finalizing, I would definitely suggest you to follow Rasheed. If no questions pop up anymore,
give me ideas on like topics for I was just telling Jules, like just trying to get into the dissertation this fall. If you had like interesting topics of like what to do research on, would be great. But yeah, thank you, Jules.
And yeah, we will call it a day. We will wait like 2 more minutes in the chat or in the call, Rasheed. And then once again, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. And definitely keep an eye on the Rankscale Summer Camp overview page to find an entire overview of all the webinars that we still are going to conduct until the end of September. Thank you very much, everybody.